The loneliest child in the room was sitting beside a billionaire. On a busy Friday evening, the dining room of the Crescent House looked exactly the way people imagined success should look. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath warm chandeliers. Soft piano music drifted through the air. Business leaders, celebrities, and investors filled the tables, speaking loudly, laughing easily, and competing for attention without even realizing it. Every seat seemed occupied. Every conversation seemed important. Yet in the center of all that noise sat a 10-year-old boy who looked completely alone. Noah Hayes sat beside his father at a long table reserved for special guests. He wore a neatly pressed navy sweater and held a small sketchbook against his chest. His light brown hair was carefully combed. His blue eyes moved quietly around the room. Watching, observing, waiting. Nobody noticed. At least, nobody seemed to. Across the table, Jonathan Hayes shook hands with a real estate developer. To his left, a venture capitalist was discussing market forecasts. To his right, someone was complimenting a recent acquisition. Phones lit up. Glasses clinked. Waiters moved through the room, carrying trays of food. The billionaire sat at the center of it all, surrounded by admiration. Meanwhile, his son sat less than 3 feet away and might as well have been invisible. Noah glanced toward a group of adults laughing at a nearby table. Then he looked down at his sketchbook. He opened it slowly. Inside were dozens of pencil drawings. Buildings, trees, faces, birds, tiny moments he had captured from the world around him. He turned another page, then another. Nobody asked to see them. Nobody asked what he was drawing. Nobody even seemed curious. The boy simply closed the sketchbook again and rested his hands on the cover. Around him, conversations continued without pause. Several guests smiled politely in his direction. A few nodded. One woman patted him gently on the shoulder before immediately returning her attention to his father. Noah smiled back each time. A small smile. Practiced. Familiar. The kind children learn when they do not expect anyone to stay long enough to truly know them. Near the service station, Grace Mitchell adjusted the strap of her apron and picked up a tray of drinks. At 29, she had worked enough restaurant shifts to read a room quickly. She knew who wanted attention. She knew who wanted privacy. She knew who tipped generously and who never noticed the people serving them. As she moved through the dining room, her eyes briefly settled on Jonathan Hayes' table. Most employees recognized the billionaire immediately. Grace barely looked at him. Something else caught her attention instead. The boy. Not because he was sitting quietly. Plenty of children sat quietly in expensive restaurants. It was the way he watched people. As though he were standing outside a window looking in. As though everyone else had been invited into a conversation he could not join. Grace slowed for a moment. Noah looked toward his father. Jonathan was smiling at something someone had said. The people around him laughed. Noah smiled too, even though he had not heard any of it. Then he lowered his eyes once more. Grace continued walking, but something about that moment stayed with her. She could not explain why. Not yet. She only knew that in a room filled with hundreds of voices, the person she noticed most was the child who never spoke. Grace tried to focus on her work, but her attention kept drifting back toward the same table. She carried plates from the kitchen, refilled water glasses, smiled politely at guests. Yet every time she crossed the dining room, her eyes found Noah Hayes. It was not because he was causing trouble. Quite the opposite. The boy sat so quietly that most people probably forgot he was there. That was what bothered her. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The restaurant grew louder as the evening crowd settled in. Conversations overlapped. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Servers moved quickly between tables carrying trays filled with steaks, seafood, and desserts. At Jonathan Hayes' table, important people continued arriving. One guest stayed for 10 minutes. Another for 15. Some wanted business advice. Others wanted photographs. Everyone wanted something from the billionaire. Nobody seemed interested. In the child sitting beside him, Noah opened his sketchbook again. Grace noticed because she happened to be passing nearby with a tray of iced tea. This time she caught a glimpse of the page before he turned it. It was a drawing of the dining room. Not a simple sketch. A detailed one. Every table appeared carefully placed. Every light fixture was drawn with precision. Tiny figures filled the room. Grace almost stopped walking. The drawing looked like something created by someone much older than 10. By the time she reached the service station, she found herself thinking about it. Most children Noah's age spent dinners staring at tablets or phones. Noah spent his time observing, recording, paying attention. The realization stayed with her. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a basket of warm bread. Jonathan was speaking with 3 executives seated across from him. Their conversation seemed animated. Noah sat quietly beside them. His untouched dinner remained on the table. The boy was not looking at the food. He was watching faces, watching lips, watching expressions, as though he were trying to piece together a conversation from fragments. Grace slowed slightly. Then she noticed something else. Whenever someone at the table laughed, Noah smiled a second later. Whenever people reacted to a story, he copied their reactions after watching them. It was subtle, easy to miss. Yet once she saw it, she could not unsee it. The smile did not begin with understanding. It began with observation. A strange sadness settled over her. Across the room, a little girl was excitedly showing her parents a drawing she had made. At another table, a teenage boy was arguing with his father about baseball. Normal family moments. Imperfect, messy, human. Meanwhile, Noah sat surrounded by people and somehow seemed farther away than anyone in the restaurant. Grace looked toward Jonathan Hayes. The billionaire was not ignoring his son intentionally. That much was obvious. Several times he rested a hand on Noah's shoulder. Once he smiled at him warmly. Once he asked if he was doing okay. Noah nodded each time. But the conversations never lasted more than a few seconds before another executive interrupted. Another question arrived. Another business topic took over. The pattern repeated again and again. Noah always came second. Not because he was unloved. Because everyone assumed there would be more time later. Grace had seen that mistake before. As she collected empty plates nearby, Noah suddenly looked up. For the briefest moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. The boy offered a small, polite smile. Then he lowered his gaze and returned to his sketchbook. Grace smiled back. Something told her that before the night was over, she would learn why that child seemed so alone in a room full of people. Most people in the restaurant knew Jonathan Hayes by reputation long before they ever met him. His name appeared in financial magazines. Business channels invited him for interviews. Universities asked him to give speeches about leadership and innovation. To many people, he represented success itself. The kind of success measured in skyscrapers, company valuations, and headlines. As the evening continued, the evidence surrounded him. Every few minutes, someone approached his table. A restaurant manager stopped by to personally welcome him. 2 investors asked for a photograph. A local entrepreneur thanked him for advice that had changed her career. Jonathan greeted each person with patience and professionalism. He smiled, listened, asked thoughtful questions. He remembered names. Grace noticed all of it while moving through the dining room. The billionaire was not arrogant. If anything, he seemed surprisingly approachable. Yet the more she observed him, the more she noticed a strange contradiction. Everyone wanted a piece of Jonathan Hayes. Almost nobody wanted a moment with his son. At one point, a group of guests gathered beside the table for a conversation that lasted nearly 15 minutes. Noah sat quietly among them. Not a single person addressed him directly. One woman smiled and said, "You must be proud of your father." Then she turned back toward Jonathan before Noah could even respond. The boy lowered his eyes to his sketchbook again. Grace felt something tighten inside her chest. Jonathan seemed unaware of the pattern. Not because he did not care, because he was constantly being pulled in 10 different directions at once. Every time he tried focusing on Noah, another conversation arrived. Another business matter appeared. Another person needed something. The evening carried him along like a current. From a distance, Grace watched him place a hand gently on Noah's shoulder. The gesture was sincere, protective, familiar. Noah smiled at his father immediately. There was affection there. Trust too. Yet something else lingered beneath it. A quiet distance neither seemed able to cross. Near the dessert station, Grace polished a stack of plates while keeping one eye on the dining room. She noticed Noah looking toward the entrance as families arrived. A little boy ran excitedly into his father's arms. Noah watched for several seconds. Then he returned to drawing. Moments later, a mother bent down beside her daughter to help her read the menu. Noah watched that too. The observations lasted only seconds at a time. Tiny moments. Easy to miss. Yet Grace kept noticing them. It was as though Noah spent his evening studying connections he could see but not fully reach. An hour after arriving, Jonathan finally glanced toward his son's untouched dinner. Concern crossed his face. He leaned closer and said something. Noah looked up immediately. The boy nodded. Jonathan smiled and spoke again. Noah nodded once more. Then Jonathan's phone vibrated on the table. A message appeared. Another executive approached. Another discussion began. The moment vanished almost as quickly as it had arrived. Noah stared at the table for a few seconds before opening his sketchbook again. Grace found herself wondering what it must feel like to spend every day beside one of the most powerful men in the country and still feel alone. The thought stayed with her as she delivered another tray of drinks. Then something unexpected happened. A young server accidentally dropped a spoon near Noah's chair. The metal utensil struck the floor with a sharp sound that caused several nearby guests to turn around. Noah did not react at all, not even slightly. Grace stopped walking. For the first time that evening, a piece of the puzzle began to fall into place. Grace stood motionless for a second after the spoon hit the floor. The sharp metallic sound had turned several heads across the dining room. A nearby guest glanced over. The young server immediately apologized. Yet Noah never reacted. He did not flinch. He did not look up. He continued sketching as though nothing had happened. Most people would have missed it. Grace did not. The realization arrived quietly. Suddenly, dozens of small moments from the evening began connecting in her mind. The delayed smiles. The way Noah watched people's faces instead of listening to them. The way he followed conversations with his eyes. The way he seemed to study lips whenever someone spoke nearby. Grace lowered her tray onto the service station and looked back toward the table. Noah was carefully shading a drawing of the restaurant chandelier. Completely focused. Completely calm. Around him, conversations flowed endlessly. Yet he existed inside a different kind of silence. Not an empty silence. A lived-in silence. One he had probably known for years. A few minutes later, Grace carried a fresh basket of bread toward the table. This time she paid closer attention. Jonathan was discussing an upcoming project with two investors. One investor told a joke. Everyone laughed. Noah smiled after watching the others laugh. Another executive leaned across the table and spoke rapidly. Noah shifted his attention from face to face, trying to follow the exchange. Nobody seemed to notice the effort it required. Grace felt a sudden wave of sadness. Not because Noah was deaf, because so few people appeared willing to meet him where he was. She placed the bread basket down carefully. Noah glanced up and offered the same polite smile he seemed to give everyone. Grace smiled back. Then she noticed something attached discreetly behind his right ear. A hearing device. Small. Easy to overlook. The final piece of the puzzle settled into place. Grace nodded softly to herself and stepped away. Across the dining room, she found herself thinking about her younger sister, Lily. Years ago, Lily had lost much of her hearing after a serious illness. Their family had spent months learning new ways to communicate, new ways to listen, new ways to connect. Grace still remembered sitting at the kitchen table practicing sign language late into the night. She remembered how frustrated Lily became when people spoke about her instead of to her. Most of all, she remembered the look on her sister's face whenever someone made the effort to communicate directly. It was not gratitude. It was relief. The relief of being seen. The memory stayed with Grace as she worked. Every time she looked toward Noah, she saw small reminders of Lily. The careful observation. The patience. The loneliness hidden behind good manners. An hour earlier, Noah had seemed like just another quiet child sitting beside a powerful father. Now Grace saw something different. She saw a boy navigating a world that rarely slowed down long enough to include him. At Jonathan's table, another guest arrived. Another conversation began. Another round of introductions filled the evening. Noah listened the only way he could. By watching. By reading faces. By piecing together fragments. Grace stood near the dessert station holding a tray of hot chocolate and suddenly noticed something else. For nearly 2 hours, not a single person had attempted to communicate with Noah in a way designed for him. Not one. She looked toward the boy again. Noah happened to glance in her direction at the same moment. This time, instead of looking away immediately, Grace held his gaze for a second longer. And for the first time that evening, an idea began forming in her mind. The idea stayed with Grace for the next 20 minutes. She tried to focus on orders and table numbers, but every time she passed through the dining room, she found herself looking toward Noah. The boy continued sketching quietly, while conversations flowed around him like a river moving past a stone. Guests came and went. Executives arrived and departed. Servers replaced plates and refilled glasses. Yet Noah remained in the same seat, patiently observing a world that rarely paused long enough to notice him. Grace carried a tray of desserts from the kitchen and stopped briefly beside the service station. Her eyes drifted toward the table. Again, Noah was alone for the moment. Jonathan had stepped a few feet away to greet another guest near the entrance. For the first time all evening, nobody was speaking to the boy. Nobody was even facing him. Noah sat with his sketchbook open on the table. His pencil rested motionless in his hand. He looked tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. The kind of tiredness that comes from spending hours trying to stay connected to conversations that were never designed for you. Grace looked down at the tray she was carrying. One of the desserts was a small chocolate mousse topped with whipped cream. Noah had glanced at it earlier when another table ordered the same item. The detail returned to her memory unexpectedly. She hesitated. Then she made a decision. A few minutes later, she approached the table carrying a fresh glass of water and the small dessert. Noah looked up politely as she arrived. Grace set the water down first. Then she placed the dessert beside his sketchbook. Noah blinked in surprise. He immediately looked around the table, clearly wondering whether it belonged to someone else. Grace smiled. The boy looked back at her. For a moment, neither moved. Neither spoke. The restaurant noise faded into the background. Then Grace did something she had not done in years. Slowly and carefully, she raised one hand. Noah's eyes followed the movement. Grace formed a simple sign. A single word. Hello. The reaction was instant. Noah froze. Completely froze. His eyes widened. The pencil slipped from his fingers and rolled gently across the table. For a second, he looked as though he could not quite believe what he had seen. Then he looked directly at her hands again. Grace repeated the sign. Hello. Noah stared at her. Not with confusion. With astonishment. Around them, the restaurant continued its endless rhythm. Plates moved. Glasses clinked. Conversations rose and fell. Nobody else noticed the moment taking place at that table. Yet for Noah, the room seemed to stop. Slowly, almost cautiously, he raised his own hand. His movements were smaller than Grace remembered from her lessons with Lily. More careful, more deliberate, but the sign was unmistakable. Hello. Grace felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. Noah looked at her for another second. Then something changed. The guarded expression he had worn all evening disappeared. The practiced smile vanished. In its place appeared something real. Something effortless. Something that had not been there before. Noah smiled. Not because he was being polite. Not because he was expected to. He smiled because for the first time that night, someone had spoken directly to him. For several seconds, neither Grace nor Noah seemed aware of anything else happening around them. The restaurant remained crowded. Glasses continued clinking. Conversations carried on beneath the soft piano music. Yet at that table, a different world had opened. Noah's smile remained fixed on his face as though he were afraid it might disappear if he moved too quickly. Grace smiled back. She had seen that expression before. Years ago, Lily used to wear the same look whenever someone surprised her by signing even a few simple words. It was the look of someone realizing they had been noticed. Noah glanced down at the chocolate mousse sitting beside his sketchbook. Then he looked back at Grace. Carefully, he raised one hand again. Thank you. The sign was clear. Grace immediately responded. You are welcome. Noah laughed silently. The sound never reached the room, but the joy reached his eyes. It transformed his entire face. Suddenly, he looked less like a lonely child sitting among strangers and more like what he actually was. A 10-year-old boy. Curious. Bright. Alive. Grace pointed gently toward the dessert. Noah nodded enthusiastically and picked up his spoon. Before taking a bite, however, he opened his sketchbook and turned it toward her. Grace leaned slightly closer. The page showed a detailed drawing of the dining room. Every table appeared carefully placed. The chandelier above was drawn with remarkable precision. Tiny figures filled the room. Grace's eyes widened. She pointed toward the drawing and then signed a simple word. Beautiful. Noah stared at her for a second. Then his smile grew even wider. He looked down shyly before signing back. Really? Grace nodded immediately. Really? Noah's shoulders relaxed. It was such a small exchange. A single compliment. Yet Grace sensed how much it meant to him. Across the room, dozens of adults were discussing companies worth millions of dollars. Yet at this table, a simple acknowledgement seemed more valuable than any business deal. Noah quickly flipped through several pages. Grace caught glimpses of city buildings, park scenes, family pets, and faces he had sketched from memory. The talent was undeniable. Each drawing captured details most people overlooked. The curve of a smile, the tilt of a lamp, the posture of someone lost in thought. Grace found herself impressed. More than impressed. She was fascinated. The boy had spent the evening observing everyone around him. Now she could see what he had been doing with those observations. He had been turning them into art. For the first time that night, Noah appeared eager to communicate. He pointed toward different drawings and used simple signs. Grace responded whenever she could remember the proper words. When she forgot, they improvised with gestures and smiles. Somehow it worked. Better than she expected. Better than many spoken conversations she had witnessed that evening. Several minutes passed before either noticed Jonathan returning to the table. The billionaire slowed as he approached. At first, he looked confused, then surprised. He stopped completely. From a distance of only a few feet, Jonathan watched something he had not seen all night. His son was not merely smiling. He was glowing. Noah was animated, engaged, excited. The boy who had spent hours sitting quietly was suddenly sharing drawings, laughing silently, and communicating with complete confidence. Jonathan stood there for a moment without interrupting. His eyes moved from Noah to Grace and back again. A question formed on his face. Not suspicion, not concern, something much simpler. He wanted to know what had just happened. Jonathan Hayes remained where he was for several moments, watching from a distance. Throughout the evening, he had seen Noah smile politely. He had seen him nod. He had seen him sit patiently through countless conversations. But this was different. This smile came from somewhere deeper. It was spontaneous, genuine, the kind that reached the eyes before it reached the mouth. Jonathan could not remember the last time he had seen it. Around him, the restaurant continued moving at its usual pace. A business partner was still waiting near the entrance. His phone vibrated twice inside his jacket pocket. Somewhere behind him, someone called his name. Yet for once, Jonathan ignored all of it. His attention remained fixed on his son. Noah had turned another page in the sketchbook and was showing it to Grace. The waitress leaned forward slightly and signed something. Noah laughed silently again before responding with a few signs of his own. The exchange was simple, natural, comfortable, and somehow that made it even more remarkable. Jonathan slowly returned to the table. Neither Noah nor Grace noticed immediately. They were too focused on the conversation unfolding between them. Grace pointed toward one of the drawings. Noah eagerly explained something using a combination of signs and gestures. The excitement on the boy's face was impossible to miss. Finally, Noah glanced up and saw his father standing nearby. His smile remained. That alone surprised Jonathan. Usually when adults approached, Noah became quieter, more reserved. This time he looked eager to share what had just happened. Jonathan pulled out his chair and sat down beside him. Noah immediately opened the sketchbook to his favorite drawing and turned it toward his father. Jonathan studied the page. It showed a city park at sunset. Tiny details filled every corner. Families walking dogs. Children flying kites. Reflections in a pond. The drawing was beautiful. More beautiful than Jonathan realized. He suddenly wondered how many similar drawings he had never truly examined. Noah pointed excitedly at the page and then toward Grace. Jonathan looked up. Grace stood holding her tray, suddenly aware that she had become the center of attention. "I hope you do not mind," she said. "We were just talking about his drawings." Jonathan glanced back toward Noah. The boy was practically glowing. "Talking?" Jonathan asked gently. Grace smiled, a little differently than most people. Understanding began to settle across Jonathan's face. He looked from Grace to Noah and then back again. "You know sign language?" Grace nodded. "Some. My younger sister is hearing impaired." Jonathan leaned back slightly. For a moment, he seemed unsure what to say. Then he looked toward Noah again. The boy quickly signed something. Grace watched and smiled. Jonathan noticed. "What did he say?" he asked. Grace hesitated before translating. "He said he likes your tie tonight." Jonathan blinked, then laughed softly. It was such an ordinary comment, such a simple observation. Yet it struck him unexpectedly, because Noah had been sitting beside him for hours. And somehow this waitress had learned more about what his son was thinking in 10 minutes than anyone else had all evening. Jonathan looked at Noah carefully, really looked at him, not at the hearing device behind his ear, not at the sketchbook, not at the quiet behavior people always noticed first. He looked at the child himself. And for the first time that evening, Jonathan began to wonder how many things his son had been trying to say all along. The rest of the dining room seemed to fade into the background for Jonathan Hayes. For years, he had built his life around solving problems, closing deals, and making decisions that affected thousands of people. He prided himself on noticing details others missed. Yet as he sat beside Noah that evening, a troubling thought settled quietly into his mind. How had a waitress discovered something about his son in 10 minutes that he had overlooked for years? Grace sensed the change in his expression immediately. It was not guilt. Not exactly. It was realization. The kind that arrives slowly and refuses to leave. Noah, meanwhile, remained completely focused on the conversation. He flipped through more pages of his sketchbook, eager to share his work. Grace pointed to a drawing of a lakeside park. Noah signed several quick explanations. Grace followed most of them and smiled when she understood. Whenever she missed a sign, Noah patiently repeated it. The exchange looked effortless. Jonathan watched every second. What surprised him most was not the sign language itself. It was the confidence appearing in his son. Throughout the evening, Noah had seemed small, careful, reserved. Now he looked larger somehow, more present, as if a door had quietly opened inside him. A group of business associates approached the table again. Normally, Jonathan would have welcomed the interruption immediately. This time, he barely noticed them. One man started discussing a possible investment opportunity. Another mentioned a conference scheduled for the following month. Jonathan listened politely for a moment before doing something unusual. He excused himself from the conversation. The men looked surprised. Jonathan rarely walked away from business discussions. Yet he returned his attention to Noah without hesitation. Grace noticed. So did Noah. The boy's eyes widened slightly. His father was choosing to stay. Choosing him. It was a small moment, almost invisible to everyone else. Yet it mattered. Jonathan picked up the sketchbook resting on the table. Slowly, he turned through the pages. Dozens of drawings filled the book. Hundreds of hours of observation. Buildings, streets, trees, family pets, restaurant guests, faces captured with remarkable detail. Jonathan paused at one particular drawing. It showed a man sitting at a table, checking his phone, while a child sat beside him. The child looked toward the man. The man never looked back. Jonathan stared at the image for several seconds. Noah shifted slightly in his seat. The drawing was not cruel. It was not angry. It was simply honest. Somehow that made it more powerful. Jonathan looked up at his son. Noah lowered his eyes briefly. Grace watched the exchange without saying a word. Some moments did not need translation. Around them, the restaurant continued buzzing with life. Yet Jonathan felt strangely removed from it all. His attention remained on the sketchbook in front of him. Suddenly, he realized those drawings were not just pictures. They were Noah's conversations with the world. His observations. His thoughts. His feelings. Things he had been sharing all along. Things few people had taken the time to read. Jonathan closed the sketchbook gently and handed it back. Then he looked at Grace. I think I have been missing a lot, he admitted quietly. Grace said nothing at first. She simply glanced toward Noah. The boy was watching both of them carefully. Then she offered a small smile. I think he has been trying to show you for a long time. The words were gentle. Yet they stayed with Jonathan long after she walked away. For the next half hour, something unusual happened at table 12. The conversations around Jonathan Hayes continued exactly as before. Investors still approached him. Business partners still asked questions. Restaurant guests still wanted a moment of his attention. Yet for the first time that evening, Jonathan was not completely absorbed by them. Part of his attention remained with Noah. He found himself watching his son differently. Not as a child sitting quietly beside him. As a person with thoughts, interests, and stories he had not fully explored. Noah noticed the change immediately. Children often did. They sensed a tension the way others sense changes in weather. Each time Jonathan looked toward him, Noah's expression softened slightly. The distance between them seemed a little smaller than before. Grace continued working throughout the dining room, but she occasionally glanced toward the table. Every time she did, she noticed another small change. Jonathan asking Noah a question. Noah opening the sketchbook without being prompted. Father and son sharing brief moments that had been missing earlier. None of it was dramatic. That was what made it meaningful. Real change rarely arrived all at once. Sometimes it appeared in tiny choices repeated over and over again. Near the end of the evening, Grace returned to refill water glasses. Noah immediately looked up. He smiled and signed a greeting. Grace smiled back. Jonathan watched the exchange carefully. Then curiosity got the better of him. "How much sign language do you know?" he asked. Grace set down the pitcher. "Enough to hold simple conversations. I learned years ago with my sister." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Noah has been using it since he was very young." His voice carried a trace of regret. "I learned some basics when he was diagnosed, but I never became fluent." The admission seemed difficult for him. Grace understood why. Noah looked down at the table. Not embarrassed. Just listening. Jonathan continued. "I always thought there would be more time." Grace had heard that sentence before. Most people spoke it after looking back. Very few recognized it while the opportunity still existed. She glanced toward Noah. The boy was tracing small circles on the edge of his sketchbook with one finger, waiting quietly. Then Grace signed a simple question toward him. "Do you like drawing more than baseball?" Noah laughed immediately and nodded. Then he signed an enthusiastic response. Grace translated. "He says baseball is boring because the players stand around too much." Jonathan blinked in surprise. Then he laughed. A real laugh. The kind that arrived unexpectedly. "I did not know that." Noah looked at his father and raised an eyebrow. Grace translated again. "He says he told you 3 times. For a second, Jonathan looked confused. Then realization appeared. Noah had probably communicated it in ways Jonathan never fully understood. The billionaire shook his head and laughed at himself. Noah laughed too. It was a small joke. Yet something important had happened. They were sharing the same moment. The same conversation. Not through assumptions. Not through guesswork. Through understanding. Grace watched quietly as father and son continued interacting. She noticed the way Noah's eyes brightened whenever Jonathan responded directly to him. Not about him. To him. The distinction mattered. More than most people realized. A few minutes later, Noah signed something longer. Grace began translating, then stopped halfway. Her expression changed. Jonathan noticed immediately. "What did he say?" he asked softly. Grace looked from Noah to Jonathan. Then she took a slow breath. "He said there is something he wishes people understood about him." The question hung gently in the air between them. Noah looked at his father, then at Grace. The restaurant around them remained busy, but the table felt strangely quiet. Not empty. Focused. Important. Noah took a slow breath and began signing again. His movements were careful, deliberate, as though he had thought about these words many times before. Grace watched closely. The signs were simple, yet the meaning behind them carried weight far beyond their simplicity. When Noah finished, Grace did not translate immediately. For a moment, she simply looked at him. Then she turned toward Jonathan. "He said that people always try to fix his ears before they try to know him." Jonathan stared at her. Grace continued softly. "He said most people meet him and immediately think about what he cannot hear. Very few ask what he likes, what he thinks, or what he dreams about." The words settled over the table. Noah lowered his eyes toward the sketchbook. His fingers rested on the cover. Jonathan did not speak. He simply listened. For years, business meetings had trained him to respond quickly, to solve problems, to offer solutions. Yet sitting across from his son, he realized this was not a problem waiting to be solved. It was a truth waiting to be heard. Noah signed something else. Grace translated again. "He says sometimes people talk about him while he is sitting right there." Jonathan felt something tighten inside his chest. He remembered doctors, consultants, teachers, specialists, conferences, meetings, countless conversations about Noah's future, about accommodations, about strategies, about challenges. So many discussions had happened around his son. How many had happened with him? The question lingered. Noah looked up and continued signing. This time his hands moved more confidently. The hesitation from earlier was gone. Years of thoughts seemed to be finding a path into the open. Grace translated carefully. "He says he likes when people are curious about him." She smiled faintly. "Not because he is deaf, just because he is Noah." Jonathan lowered his gaze. Across the table sat a boy who loved drawing parks and city skylines. A boy who thought baseball was boring. A boy who noticed tiny details most people missed. A boy with opinions, humor, creativity, and dreams. Yet so often the first thing people saw was a hearing device. The realization was painful, not because anyone intended harm, because good intentions had sometimes become barriers of their own. Nearby, the piano player began a slower song. Soft notes drifted through the dining room. Candlelight reflected across crystal glasses. Around them, Hundreds of conversations continued. Yet Jonathan heard only one, the one he should have been hearing for years. Noah signed again. Grace watched and smiled before translating. He says tonight was nice because someone talked to him instead of about him. Jonathan looked toward Grace. She immediately shook her head. That was not about me. Then she glanced toward Noah. I think he is talking about both of us. For several seconds, father and son simply looked at each other. No business deals. No schedules. No interruptions. Just a quiet understanding beginning to form. Then Noah slowly reached for his pencil and opened to a blank page in the sketchbook. He began drawing. Jonathan watched curiously. A few quick lines appeared. Then more. After several minutes, Noah turned the sketchbook around. Grace looked down first. Then Jonathan. The drawing showed 3 people sitting at a table. A boy, a waitress, a father. And for the first time in any drawing that evening, all 3 were facing one another. Jonathan stared at the drawing for a long time. It was simple compared to some of Noah's earlier work. There were no detailed buildings, no intricate landscapes, no dramatic shading. Yet somehow it felt more important than all the others. 3 people sitting together at a table, looking at one another, connected, present. The kind of scene most families would consider ordinary. For Noah, it had been worth drawing. That realization lingered in Jonathan's mind. Grace looked at the sketch and felt a quiet emotion she could not quite describe. The drawing was not about artistic skill. It was about belonging. Noah had spent the evening observing people from the outside. For the first time, he had drawn himself inside the moment. Across the dining room, guests continued enjoying their meals. Some were ordering dessert. Others were preparing to leave. The evening was slowly winding down. Yet at table 12, nobody seemed eager for it to end. Noah carefully closed the sketchbook and rested his hand on top of it. Then he looked at his father. Jonathan noticed something immediately. The nervousness that often appeared in Noah's eyes was gone. The boy seemed lighter, more relaxed, more certain that he was being heard. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. Can you teach me something? He asked. Noah blinked in surprise. Grace smiled before translating the question into sign language. Noah's eyes widened. For a moment, he simply stared at his father. Then a smile spread across his face. Slowly, he raised his hands. Jonathan watched closely. Noah demonstrated a simple sign. Grace translated. Friend. Jonathan repeated the movement awkwardly. Noah laughed immediately. The attempt was far from perfect. Jonathan tried again. Noah corrected him. Then he tried a third time. Better. The boy nodded enthusiastically. A quiet sense of pride appeared on his face. Grace stepped back slightly, allowing the moment to belong to them. She watched as Noah taught another sign. Then another. Jonathan followed carefully. The billionaire who negotiated complex business agreements around the world now concentrated fully on the movements of a 10-year-old boy's hands. It was one of the most beautiful things Grace had seen all year. Several nearby guests began noticing the interaction. One elderly couple smiled as they watched. A young mother sitting at another table quietly nudged her husband and pointed toward the scene. Nobody interrupted. They simply observed. Sometimes kindness creates its own silence. Noah taught the sign for family. Jonathan repeated it. Then the sign for thank you. Then the sign for happy. Each successful attempt made Noah smile a little wider. The distance that had seemed so large earlier in the evening continued shrinking with every gesture. Eventually, Jonathan paused. He looked at his son carefully. Really carefully. Then he signed the word thank you. The movement was imperfect. Clumsy. Yet understandable. Noah froze. The smile faded briefly, replaced by something deeper. Emotion. Grace looked away for a moment, giving them privacy. She remembered Lily's face years ago when their father learned enough sign language to hold a real conversation. Some moments stay with people forever. This felt like one of them. Noah slowly signed something back. Jonathan glanced toward Grace for help. She translated softly. He said, "You are welcome, Dad." Neither spoke after that. They did not need to. The message had already reached exactly where it was meant to go. And for the first time that evening, Jonathan Hayes realized that the most important conversation of his entire day had not happened in a boardroom, on a phone call, or during a business meeting. It had happened at a restaurant table with his son. By the time the evening began winding down, something inside Jonathan Hayes felt different. The restaurant had gradually emptied. Several business associates had already left. The piano player was finishing the final songs of the night. Staff members moved quietly between tables, clearing dishes and extinguishing candles. Yet Jonathan barely noticed any of it. His attention remained on Noah. The realization was uncomfortable because it was honest. Throughout his career, he had measured success by growth charts, company milestones, and ambitious goals achieved. Every year had been dedicated to building a future for his family. Every sacrifice had seemed justified. Every long night at the office had a purpose. Yet sitting across from Noah now, Jonathan found himself confronting a question he had avoided for years. What was the value of building a future for someone if you missed too much of their present? The thought stayed with him. Noah was sketching again, though now he occasionally looked up and signed small comments to his father. Jonathan responded as best he could with the few signs he had just learned. The conversations were simple, sometimes awkward, yet they felt strangely meaningful. Grace watched from across the room while organizing receipts near the service station. She smiled every time she saw Noah teaching another sign. The boy looked proud, not because he was receiving attention, because he was finally sharing something important to him. At one point, Noah signed a word too quickly. Jonathan misunderstood completely. Noah burst into silent laughter. Jonathan laughed too. The moment lasted only a few seconds. Yet Grace noticed something remarkable. Earlier that evening, Noah had been observing life from the outside. Now he was participating in it. Near closing time, Jonathan stood and walked toward the large windows overlooking the city. The lights beyond the glass stretched across the skyline like stars scattered among buildings. For years he had stood in front of views like this and thought about opportunities, markets, investments, expansion plans. Tonight his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He remembered school events missed because of meetings, weekend plans postponed because of travel, conversations shortened because of deadlines. None of those decisions had seemed significant at the time. Each had appeared temporary. Yet standing there now, he could see how temporary choices eventually become permanent memories. Behind him, Noah was showing Grace another drawing. Jonathan watched their reflection in the glass. Then he smiled softly. Perhaps not everything was too late. Perhaps some things could still be repaired. He returned to the table and sat beside his son. Noah immediately looked up. Jonathan hesitated for a moment before raising his hands. The signs were not perfect. They were slow and uncertain. But Noah understood them instantly. Tomorrow. Practice. More. Noah stared at him. Then his eyes widened. Jonathan repeated the signs again. Tomorrow. Practice. More. The boy's smile appeared immediately. He nodded so enthusiastically that Grace could not help laughing. Jonathan laughed too. For the first time in a very long while, tomorrow felt less like a business objective and more like a promise. A promise to learn. A promise to listen. A promise to be present. Noah closed his sketchbook and held it against his chest. The restaurant lights dimmed slightly as closing time approached. Outside, the city continued moving beneath the night sky. Inside, a father and son sat together planning something much more valuable than a meeting. They were planning time. 3 weeks later, the lunch crowd at the Crescent House filled the restaurant with the familiar rhythm of conversation, clinking glasses, and footsteps crossing polished floors. Grace moved between tables carrying orders and greeting guests just as she had done hundreds of times before. Most days blended together. Most customers came and went without leaving much of an impression. Yet every now and then, a moment arrived that reminded her why people mattered more than routines. Near the entrance, the host suddenly smiled toward a newly arriving guest. Grace glanced up from the service station and immediately recognized them. Jonathan Hayes walked through the doors beside Noah. This time there was no crowd of executives surrounding them. No investors waiting for introductions. No phones pressed against Jonathan's ear. It was just a father and his son. Noah spotted Grace first. His face lit up instantly. Before she could even approach, he raised both hands and signed a greeting across the room. Grace laughed and signed back. Several nearby guests looked curious. Noah did not seem to notice. Or perhaps he simply did not care anymore. Confidence had replaced the hesitation she remembered from that evening weeks earlier. Jonathan smiled as he watched the exchange. The difference in both of them was impossible to miss. They settled into a table near the window. A few minutes later, Grace brought menus. Before she could say a word, Jonathan signed something toward Noah. The movements were still imperfect, slower than Noah's. Yet they were recognizable. Noah immediately answered. Then another exchange followed. Then another. Grace stood there for a moment, smiling. The promise made that night had become something real. During lunch, Noah pulled out his sketchbook again. He eagerly showed Grace several new drawings. One featured a city park filled with families. Another showed the Chicago skyline at sunset. One page made Grace pause. It depicted two people sitting together at a kitchen table practicing sign language. Jonathan noticed her reaction. "That one is from last Saturday," he said. "We spent 4 hours learning together." Noah grinned proudly. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. The drawing itself was beautiful, but the story behind it was even better. As lunch continued, Jonathan shared something quietly. "I changed my schedule." Grace looked surprised. Jonathan nodded. "Fewer evening meetings. More weekends at home." He glanced toward Noah. "Turns out my company survives without me for a few hours." Noah laughed silently at that. Jonathan laughed too. The sound carried a freedom Grace had not heard before. Sometimes success teaches people how to build extraordinary things. Sometimes it takes much longer to teach them what is truly worth building. Eventually lunch came to an end. Noah closed his sketchbook and carefully tore out a single page. He handed it to Grace. She looked down. It was a drawing of a restaurant table beneath warm lights. 3 people sat together. A waitress, a father, a son. Unlike the earlier version, the details were richer now. The faces were clearer. The smiles were bigger. At the bottom of the page, Noah had written a short note in neat handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me." Grace looked up. Noah was watching her. Jonathan was too. For a moment, words felt unnecessary. She simply smiled and nodded. As they left the restaurant, Noah turned once more and signed goodbye. Grace returned the sign. Then she watched father and son walk out into the afternoon sunlight side by side. Weeks earlier, one of them had been surrounded by attention while the other felt invisible. Now neither walked alone. And perhaps that was the lesson hidden inside the entire story. The child was never invisible. The world had simply forgotten to look.